I'm delighted to welcome you all to the launch of Sally Weintrobe's new book, Psychological Roots of the Climate Crisis, Neoliberal Exceptionalism and the Culture of Uncare. I'm Randall, and I'm going to be chairing this event. I'm absolutely delighted to be here chairing the launch of this important new book by Sally. And Sally is a psychoanalyst. She's a fellow of the British Psychoanalytic Society. She's an original member of the Climate Psychology Alliance, and she's chair of the International Psychoanalytic Association's Climate Committee. She edited and contributed to Engaging with Climate Change, which is one of the foundational texts of climate psychology. And she writes and speaks widely on the subject. And her new book is a wonderful and penetrating examination of the connections between the dominant political culture and the human psyche. So I'm very pleased to be with you all today to celebrate its publication. I'm also very pleased to have with us to discuss Sally's book, Harriet Wolfe, Rob Nixon, and David Wallace-Wells. So Harriet is the president-elect of the International Psychoanalytic Association. She's clinical professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences at the University of California's San Francisco School of Medicine and Training, and she's a supervising analyst for the San Francisco Center for Psychoanalysis. And she's got a long-standing commitment to psychoanalytic public health interventions. Rob Nixon is the Barron Family Professor of Environment and Humanities at Princeton University, and his most recent book is Slow Violence and the Environmentalism of the Poor. And for the past 25 years, his writing and teaching has focused on environmental justice in the global South. Finally, David Wallace-Wells is a journalist. He's editor-at-large for the New York Magazine, and he's well known for his writings on climate change, and in particular for his book, The Uninhabitable Earth. Finally, myself, I'm a psychotherapist. I'm a founder member of the Carbon Conversations Project, co-author of the book In Time for Tomorrow, and I've been working in the field of climate psychology for about almost 20 years now. So I'm going to start by asking Sally a few questions about the book, and we'll then move to some responses from our wonderful panel of Harriet, Rob, and David, and myself. And we'll then open up to questions from the audience. So I'd like to start, Sally, just by asking you, what led you to write this book?
Thanks, Ro, and just thanks everybody for being here, speakers and everybody online. It's lovely to have you. Sorry it's not in person, but it also means we can join from all over the place. So thank you. What led me to write this book? Those questions are really hard to answer in one way, as we know. It's been a long time in the making, and I knew you were going to ask me this. And what popped into my mind is, well, first of all, I wanted to understand the climate crisis, and I knew that psychology played an important role in it. So that was my starting point. But what popped into my mind is also something that's always been with me, which is that I love detective fiction. And, you know, it started from childhood. Perhaps I'm ashamed to say, with Noddy and Enid Blyton, you know, I had them all lined up in a row. And it's who done it, you know, who done it, why did they do it, when did they do it, how did they do it? And in a way, I think that's sort of followed me all my life with my interest in psychoanalysis, and you know, that plays a part. So I'd like to thank Noddy, but I needed to make sense of it myself, and I knew very well that I needed to extend my frame, stretch myself, relate in a different way to how I was thinking psychoanalytically, and include other disciplines. And also, I wanted to write in a way that would make the problem not only more understandable to me, but to people in general.
I think that's a terrific story about Noddy, Sally, because I think it takes us into that sort of sense that what crime fiction does in the modern world is often to look at the psychological underpinnings of whatever the crime has been. And so that really, in a way, takes me into the next question, which I want to ask you, which was about whether you could tell us a little bit about this concept of uncare, which is at the heart of the book, because there are a lot of words you might have chosen for this, such as, neglect or indifference or disregard or whatever. But you chose uncare, and I think it has a particularly powerful ring to it. Could you tell us a little bit about this concept?
Yes, thanks for that question, Ro. By the way, I just wanted to backtrack a bit and say, in relation to who done it, I think the answer in this case is most of us, but really not to the same degree. And one needs to develop a sense of proportion. I forgot to add that bit in. It's that kind of mystery and problem. Moving on to uncare. Yes, I thought a lot about it. I was very interested in the culture. So you could have uncaring culture, but that in a way is descriptive of a culture, and it really wasn't doing the work, and it didn't have the heft of what I wanted. Because uncare, and I started with having a hyphen between un and care. I wanted a word, the publishers took the hyphen out, it's okay, but it's arresting. And I wanted a word that made it more clear that what I'm talking about is a culture, a dominant culture, politically imposed, with the power to do that, spread right across out against amongst all branches of culture, but that actually seeks to separate us, to uncare us, to separate us from our caring part. It's an active process. So it's in that sense that I'm talking about culture, and that's why the word. And interestingly, it's been a word that people have resonated with quite strongly.
I think that's absolutely right, and I think that what's very interesting in the book is the way that you connect up this sense of uncare with the other side of this, because you talk a lot about these ideas of exceptionalism and the magical thinking and the omnipotence, and it reminded me of a conversation I had years ago with the environmentalist Peter Harper. He used to talk about people's non-negotiables, and the way when you had a conversation about climate change with people, they would really only agree to contemplate the tiniest of either personal change or action, or even the idea that life was going to have to change in the future. And what they would present were all these things which were perhaps to us as environmentalists felt like privileges, like being able to fly or to eat meat or whatever it was. But to these people felt non-negotiable. And I think that in your book, you elaborate very, very creatively on really what this means through the use of the psychoanalytic understanding of ideas of exceptionalism and omnipotence. And I'd just like to ask you to tell us a bit more about that.
Well, there's a lot in what you've said. I mean, to start with, the non-negotiable is leans in two directions. I think it takes a narcissistic form, where there's a particular kind of entitlement to a certain position. And it's I'd rather die in a ditch than, that's the non-negotiable. It's the adamant. So it leans in a narcissistic direction. And we can see that in a toddler on the pavement having a screaming fit and saying, I will not go. So it's a part of most of us, actually, leaning in a narcissistic direction. So we don't want to face reality and fit in. But there's also another kind of non-negotiable, I think, which is when people say, no, past this, I will not put up with anything more than this. So I'm also highlighting here, because I go a lot into the differences between different kinds of the non-negotiable linked with different kinds of entitlement. And the narcissistic kind is the kind that doesn't want to fit in with a limiting reality, doesn't want to be limited by rules, facts of nature, laws of physics. And it's linked with a certain kind of feeling of entitlement to have what you want, to see yourself in very idealized terms, and also to use magical thinking to get rid of reality and reshape reality when reality stands in your way. So it doesn't understand the word no. And I remember, Ro, actually, you wrote about that years ago. I loved your idea. You had the no of nature.
That's right.
That's right.
That people wouldn't take any pay attention to the no of nature.
Yeah.
But Sally, one last thing before we move on to the responses, I would like to ask you just to say a little bit about the neoliberalism aspect of this book, because you chart very carefully the rise of the neoliberal ideology, and whereas I think other people write about it economically and criticize it on economic grounds, your criticism is actually quite different. It's about what it does to us psychologically, and I just wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about that.
Thanks for that. Well, first of all, in one way, you see, the argument is not even about neoliberalism, because exceptionalism is as old as human psychology. What I described before is being an exception. Exceptionalism is when it gets into politics and economic formations. So it's a very old human tendency, this narcissistic entitlement. And its roots are psychological in interaction with current realities. But what we saw with modernity, because of industrialization and various forces and colonialism, we saw a rapid expansion of, if you like, it's very simply put in the mantra, man holds dominance, and it has actually largely been man, not human, but man holds dominance. But what we see, and you can chart it with carbon emissions, you see the very rapid rise of this kind of thinking in which limits do not need to be respected during the neoliberal age eras, really starting from the 80s, when Reagan and Thatcher came to power. And the climate problem has massively escalated in that short time frame. And so it is in that sense that my book is about this particular type of exceptionalism, although I do caution that if we simply think that it's party politics or political regimes, we're not going deep enough. Yep.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely it. Your book is very much about depth. And I think that's probably the moment to ask Harriet Wolfe to come in, because depth is very much the business of psychoanalysis. And I know that she's got a response to your book, which I'd like to ask her to give now.
Thank you, Ro. And thank you, Sally, for this opportunity to recognize and discuss your important work. I'll speak about Sally's book from my perspective as a fellow psychoanalyst and someone who aspires to expand a clinically focused psychoanalytic culture to include active, constructive attention to societal issues, including the climate crisis. Humankind is in the midst of a number of interrelated crises at this moment in history. The threat to life posed by COVID-19 and its variants continues. Economic crisis is widespread, and outbreaks of violence between fellow humans are not only rapidly in our view through social media, but are increasingly present on the streets of our own neighborhoods worldwide. Sally draws on intersecting historical, political, economic, and psychological determinants of climate change, and captures in plain language a very shocking reality, the reality best called ecocide. People who deny the reality of climate change are stupefied if and when they recognize the reality of ecocide and their active role in it. Very few of us actively face the growing threat to natural life as we've known it. This includes many of our psychoanalytic colleagues. Psychoanalysts constitute the very group that deeply understands and seeks to treat denial, splitting, anxiety, guilt, and aggression. Yet in our daily lives, most of us live a wishful life and unwittingly deny our participation in the culture of uncare that dominates the planet. Perhaps the core of what I want to say about Sally's book is presented by her at the start of her book in a quote by Saint-Exupéry, quote, "It is very simple. You can only see with the heart," end quote. Perhaps in other words, you have to care in order to see what is before you. Sally's book is deceptively simple, and it is based on love of the planet and all that lives on it. She uses plain language to create a complex picture of the climate crisis. She builds our heart muscle so that we can better see a very threatening reality that evades our sight because the threat of loss is overwhelming. She uses plain language in combination with sophisticated interdisciplinary thinking to open our hearts and minds to the need to take action out of love for our planet and for each other. If we dispense with altruism, ignore we are part of a global human collective, and lose the ethical maxim of responsibility for the other, we lose the ties that bind humanity and the hope for a shared and satisfying future. We live the moral low ground of exceptionalism and personal interest. The reality of existential threat enters a clinician's office on a regular basis, but it may not be heard on the level it is experienced. Dread is difficult to tolerate, and like climate change, may be overlooked or underestimated. The failure to comprehend may be similar to the morning news, its handling of bad weather. At least across the United States, in recent months, in fact years, the weather is immensely variable and extremely threatening on a daily basis. There is severe drought and there are burning temperatures. There are tornadoes, torrential rains and flooding, high winds, wildfires, and ships lost at sea. Every day, super hot in one location, sudden hailstorms in another. The weather is crazy, but the reporting is simply repetitive. No one covers or questions the reasons for it. As a psychoanalyst, when a patient complains about the weather, am I ready to hear evidence of terror, of loss of life as we know it? Or will I collude unwittingly with denial of an environmental problem, an external reality that is causing a deep sense of threat? The psychoanalytic clinician's routine mental framework is a focus on the patient's inner life, inner conflict, often to the underestimation of external reality and its role in the experience of existential dread. Sally's book invites all citizens of the world to take their sociopolitical and environmental reality to heart. From my particular point of view, she has created a model for how to address our multi-determined environmental crisis through psychoanalytic understandings of the whys and ways people protect themselves in the moment at the cost of ignoring a dangerous external reality. So in closing, Sally's book inspires those of us who have been too afraid to recognize the magnitude of the climate problem to join her project as agents of change. Thank you, especially Sally.
Thank you very much, Harriet. I'd like to turn now to Rob Nixon and ask him to make his response.
Thanks so much, Ro, and thank you particularly, Sally, for writing the book and for inviting us all to participate. One of the features of the current publishing moment is that many books that are appearing now were conceived and even written pre-COVID, and so through no fault of the authors, have a built-in obsolescence, a kind of an anachronistic feel. Sally's book is the opposite. It's extremely prescient in its focus on care and the lack of care. And in that sense, it reminds us of these connections between the issues that the pandemic has thrown up and the issues that climate breakdown throws up, how these issues are globally manifested, but felt somatically, felt intimately in the body, and how we struggle to negotiate those two extremes of scale. And so over the past just a year and few months, we have had this opportunity, unwittingly and without desiring it, to rethink how we price and value care and the people who deliver care. And it seems to me no coincidence that the NHS has a more than a walk-on role in Sally's book. So it's a book about climate crisis, but also, as I read it, a book about COVID and pandemic without ever mentioning either of those words. Because our failures to adequately respond to the pandemic are in many ways similar to our failures to respond adequately to climate breakdown. And what Sally's so insistent on is to say that those failures have been individuated and internalized as failures of individual action under neoliberalism, rather than looking at the breakdown, indeed the assaults on institutional cultures of care. And so I think one of the most telling and valuable elements in the book is her history of neoliberalism, which sort of took root in the Anglosphere in the late 70s and 80s and spread to many parts of the globe from there. And so she's doing something quite courageous and quite unusual, which is trying to integrate economic perspectives, psychological perspectives, and perspectives about governance, which makes it a hugely ambitious and I think particularly original book. So in this context, we have an opportunity to ask how we value care and how we can change the institutions that underpin our society to prioritize care for the planet and care in the emergency of COVID. And so it's a book that toggles between the structural and the somatic, between these vast economic and governmental forces and the individual psychology and the individual body. So I just want to make two points with regard to this. And the first is that neoliberalism has been very much twinned to neo-Darwinism. And if we look at the rise of neoliberal thought and the institutionalizing of it in the late 70s, it coincided with the rise of sociobiology. If we think of Dawkins' The Selfish Gene and E.O. Wilson's sociobiology, so both of which argued that selfishness was the core evolutionary characteristic of Homo sapiens. And so neoliberal economists could use that argument to naturalize and fortify their argument that the mind of the market rules and that greed is good because greed is who we are. And so one of the fallouts of that has been these ever-widening chasms between the uber-rich and the ultra-poor, these widening zones of social and ecological abandonment, what is sometimes called sacrifice zones. And so Sally's book pushes back against that and is in that sense in line with much newer biological thought, which recognizes the presence and power of mutualism, what we might call self-interested altruism, that selfishness will only take you so far, that even as Darwin observed, there are these vast structures of co-evolution, interdependence. And at one point in his thinking, Darwin realized that there were so many instances in the natural world of cooperation that he wondered if it might undermine his entire evolutionary theory. It didn't, but what did happen was that these neo-Darwinists, working often in tandem with neoliberal economists, emphasized selfishness at the cost of care, at the cost of cooperation, and created a skewed deterministic scenario. So what Sally does so brilliantly in this book, I think, is unpack that, unpick it, and to say there's nothing natural about this way of running the world. It's contingent, it's historical, and it's no coincidence that she goes back at various points to the rise of the welfare state in the US and the UK as instances of a different kind of politics that valued care and equality differently. The last remark I wanted to make was about technology and climate fixes. In 2004, a very influential article called The End of Environmentalism appeared by Nordhaus and Schellenberger, who went on to found the Breakthrough Institute. And their argument was that environmentalism would never catch on because it's so negative, it's so gloomy, it's full of melancholy, grief, mourning, apocalypse, and that we need to brighten its image. And the way to do that is by recognizing that ultimately technology will be our salvation. Okay, and so the Breakthrough Institute has, I sort of call them the grief police, because they're very antithetical to what they see as negative emotions, and are much more invested in things like grandiose mega schemes like geoengineering. So as a corrective, what Sally's book does so wonderfully is to insist that the processes of mourning and grief are utterly integral. And if you suppress those processes or deny that they are integral to the human emotional spectrum, you cause at an individual and at a collective level enormous damage. So in closing, I'll just say that James Baldwin once wrote that the task of the writer is to reveal the questions behind the answers. And at a time when so much environmental hope is directed through techno-optimism, I think Sally does a terrific job of revealing those questions and coming up with some very different suggestions for the kinds of changes that we need in the culture of care that, together with technological innovations that are better distributed than they are today, could help us get closer to the kind of hope that we truly need. Thank you.
Rob, thank you very much for that. I'd like to turn to our third responder, who is David. David Wallace-Wells, over to you.
Thank you. Also, as everybody has said, I want to thank all of the people who are in the room listening. I want to thank Sally for inviting me in, especially for her book. I want to pick up actually with something that Rob said at the beginning of his remarks, which is about the prescience of this book. The subtitle refers to the roots of the climate crisis, but I think it's as important to think about its relevance for the future of the climate crisis, because I do think things have changed quite dramatically in the climate landscape just over the last several years. And I think that the ideas of exceptionalism and neoliberalism and Uncare are likely to be as important and as illuminating in that new stage as they've been thinking about the recent past. So to explain a little bit what I mean about the big shifts, in the past, I think those of us contemplating from a cultural, from an intellectual, from a psychological perspective, contemplating the problem of climate change would often ask why so little had been done, why we knew everything we've known, everything we've needed to know now for a few generations. And over the course of that time, we've not only made the problem worse, we've made it much, much worse, dramatically worse than it was when the science was first really introduced to the public. But things are changing in the sense that a lot is currently underway to address this crisis. Just over the last several years, we've had an enormous global political awakening, which seemed perhaps unthinkable half a decade or a decade ago. We've had growing climate anxiety and climate alarm all around the world. And we've had it shake our political leaders and even our corporate leaders such that they are at the very least paying lip service to the need for urgent action on climate change, and have essentially retired the language of climate denial, which governed a lot of those power structures for a generation or so. You know, I'm a climate alarmist myself. I think a lot more needs to be done than that, but I think it's also useful to recognize how significant a shift that represents and what a different world we're living in today. And yet, we are still, you know, very, very far from what would be considered a sort of safe landing future by anyone, you know, thinking about the problem even in the very recent past. So scientists have long talked about this threshold of warming 2 degrees as the threshold of catastrophe. Island nations of the world have called it genocide. African climate diplomats have said that it represented the death of their continent. If you tally up all of the recent commitments and all of the recent pledges that have been made all around the world over the last few years, you get to at least a half a degree of warming above that threshold. And what is especially disconcerting about this is that those pledges, those from China, those from the EU, from the UK, South Korea, Japan, Joe Biden's plan in the US, all of these functionally represent a maximally ambitious decarbonization path within this political and economic systems in which we live today. So one can hope for more ambition and faster planning, more aggressive government action, but without some truly fundamental change in the way that we think about the limits of human action, the way we think about the non-negotiables that Ro was talking about earlier. This is about as good as we're going to do. And presumably, you know, we're not even going to honor those pledges in the way that they've been initiated or advertised, which suggests that we are in a situation now, if we were in a situation in generations past, where we knew everything we needed to know to take action, but we did nothing. We are now in a situation where we're doing everything that our systems allow us to do, and yet it is still deeply insufficient. And the way that we relate to that gap, I think is a hugely important challenge, will be a hugely important challenge for all of us going forward at each of the levels that we operate at, you know, political, intellectual, psychological. And I do think here, the categories and the concepts that Sally has introduced in her book are enormously illuminating, although I would also say they are not all that, for me, encouraging. I think that we are likely to define the efforts to decarbonize the world that are undertaken today collectively as to see them in ideal terms, to not recognize their shortcomings, but instead to celebrate the speed at which we are moving. I think we are likely to, in order to get ourselves to that place where we can feel really good about a rapid decarbonization that nevertheless brings us well above the threshold of climate catastrophe, in order to get ourselves to a place where we can feel good about that, we're likely to extend our impulses of uncare so that we accept and normalize suffering that's brought about, especially elsewhere in the world, rather than responding to it in the way that it demands of us. And ultimately to come to terms with a world that is transformed beyond, at the very least, comfort, if not outright habitability for billions of people living elsewhere in the world, in order to feel okay about the way that people, like most of us in this room, most of us on this panel, so that people like us can feel relatively good about the way that we will be living in the middle of this century and beyond. And that dynamic in which even those who want to feel engaged in a progressive fight to stabilize the world's climate and protect the world's population, nevertheless are pulled into a form of delusion that approaches even climate denial to feel good about their own lives, I think is an incredibly dangerous trap that, you know, neoliberalism has set for us. And there is a tremendous risk that we step into it, not just by avoiding, not by avoiding climate change and avoiding the problem, but even by dealing with it simply at an insufficient scale. And to have a hope of a better outcome requires precisely the fundamental overturning of those dynamics that Sally so insightfully maps out in her book. I don't know how to feel about the prospects and possibility of that future of overturning these dynamics, but I think she's laid the roadmap for us quite beautifully. So thank you again for having me here, and I'm thrilled and honored to be a part of the discussion.
Thank you, David. Thank you to everybody who has responded. Those are three very different and fascinating responses to Sally's book. I'm just going to add a few words from my perspective, and then we're going to go back to Sally before going on to questions. And I wanted to focus on the question of communication and how do we work with the amazing scholarship and insights of Sally's book? How can we use it to bring about the kinds of changes that we need? Because I think Sally's book does change the conversation, and it does so in some very helpful ways. So a lot of my work has been involved in training people in the community in better ways of speaking about climate change and all those conversations that all of us get into, which so often go wrong and end up in things being very polarized, things being very difficult, people getting very upset. So by focusing on the process of the conversation rather than the content, which of course is what environmentalists are mostly focused on, what they want to say, rather than on the experience of the audience, I think what Sally's book does is it gives us a framework for doing this, which is actually enormously helpful. Because I think that this sense of being able to focus on the psyche in conflict, which of course is at the essence of psychoanalysis and psychotherapy, but Sally offers this to us in a very particular way, which I think is very helpful. And I think that it allows us to move forward in a way, because she brings to this conversation, paradoxically, both depth and simplicity. The depth is in the way that she teases out the ramifications and the implications of exceptionalism and omnipotence and the magical thinking and the passing of blame and the projection backwards and forwards between different individuals and different groups. But there is a simplicity in the idea that the central conflict is between this selfish, entitled, uncaring part of the self and a caring, responsible, cooperative part. Because this is straightforward to communicate, and it immediately resonates with people's experience. So it's not only that it's easy for people to identify these aspects of themselves, but I think it also allows us to frame public communications via the acknowledgement of these conflicting tendencies in us all. Sally said that these, in one sense, this is not a new idea, this is not a new conflict. And 2,000 years ago, Ovid encapsulated this conflict between the caring and the uncaring parts of the self in the famous quote, "Video meliora proboque deteriora sequa." I see and approve the better, but I follow the worse. And I think that in her book, Sally has reframed this for the 21st century, bringing psychoanalytic depth and sophistication to this core idea, along with an acute political analysis that will serve us well as we struggle in the coming decades with climate. So I will certainly be using the ideas. I will be recommending Sally's book to everyone in the campaigning movements that I know, and looking for new ways to incorporate them into workshops and presentations so that we truly begin to talk about what it feels like, what stops us, and how we can develop this caring part of ourselves, both individually and in our communities and politically. So thank you, Sally, for what I think is an extremely important book. So what I want to do now is just to come back to Sally to see if you would like to respond to what everybody has said.
Goodness. Well, first of all, thank you so much. I mean, there's a lot to digest there. Actually, one of the things that I tried to do with my book is to make this subject more digestible. So, you know, the reader can treat it like a meal and take bits and work them through in relation to themselves and the outside world, and so on and so forth. Just, I won't be able to pick up everything, of course, but just to start with what you were saying, Ro, thank you very much. You draw out the central conflict, which is the human conflict between a part of us that cares and a part of us that doesn't care. And what I want to say is that, you know, I try to use very ordinary examples to help people recognize those parts and see them in themselves, see them in their social groups and so on. But one of the reasons to go back to why I wrote this book is that I wanted to, in a way, blow the whistle. I wanted to mount an argument, and to me it's the engine house of the book, in the center of the book, on the culture of Uncare. I wanted to show how to the extent to which a culture can manipulate us. And I wanted to be able to do it in a way to help people recognize this, because we don't just care or not care as individuals. We care or not care insofar as a culture pushes us to become more caring. You know, fractures, the cover of the book shows this, you know, fractures groups of people into the entitled and the non-entitled, mounts up prejudice and so on, has a tremendously strong effect on people in terms of whether the caring part of them is stronger than the uncaring part of them. We've all got both parts, but the issue is which one is in the driving seat for a sufficient amount of time to be able to direct action. That's the issue. And what I wanted to do, because I've got a chapter on advertising, media, you know, right the way through, not all branches of culture, but many of them, and language formation and the group culture, to actually show how a culture of care will actually help us. It will provide frameworks that help us care. And these range from caring government to caring rituals, to group support, to, you know, and so on and so forth. Or we have a culture of uncare that actually drives these divisions and pushes the sort of neo-Darwin position that Rob Nixon was talking about. So I wanted to actually help create a framework for myself, and also help people recognize that these attitudes, most of which are just below the surface, we're barely conscious of them, actually don't just arise willy-nilly. They occur within a cultural framework, which I link to a neoliberal political and economic framework that actually finds this kind of behavior suits their economic base. And I wanted, so in a way, I hope that it would be helpful to people to free themselves a bit and be able to get some kind of perspective on not just be in a culture, but look on at themselves in a culture. So that was a very strong thing. And just one more word about that. I'm very struck, Rob, by you're talking about the grief police, because it's a wonderful phrase. And in a way, the culture of Uncare operates like the grief police. My model is that when we face difficult realities, certain difficult realities, and we go through a process of mourning. We don't just accept things straight away. We deny them. If we stay struggling, we then often get angry. We blame somebody else, or we blame ourselves. And then maybe we accept things a bit, and then we grieve. And it's not like a process that just goes from A to B. It's backwards and forwards and so on. My argument about the culture of uncare is that it is specifically designed to keep the population at the level stuck between denial and blaming. And in that sense, it operates like the grief police. Any sign of real grieving, because you only grieve if you actually care, it will seek to nip in the bud. Now, that's a very grand statement, and it almost sounds like a conspiracy theory. But actually, when you study how the culture operates, I think my statement is borne out. So I wanted to link it with the grief police, and the culture operates like a grief police. And lastly, I think I would say to you, David, that yes, you can look at this situation and you can see where we are, and who holds the power and so on. And it doesn't really bear too much thinking about, because it's a gloomy picture. I can't disagree with you about that. However, I also think that we've basically got 10 years to shift the story. And have massive shifts. I don't really think that we are in a position to predict how this is going to go. I don't think we can read the future just like that. And very often you can get quite sudden social changes, that have been building up for some time. So I'm not so fixed as you are. Where I don't mean you're fixed, and I recognise your position. And just to expand it, at the moment we have a situation where the narrative is about we're going to commit to net zero, and anyone who follows climate news knows that net zero is not real zero. It's got all kinds of perverse arithmetic in there, so the battle goes on, and we know that. But I think what I wanted to do to add to the issues and the perspective was to say that it seems to me that it's very important to actually really recognize just how perverse this culture has been, just how limiting of our potential it is, when you really study what the aims of this of the culture of uncare actually are on us, and that we're actually living inside a climate bubble which is a perverse bubble. It's based on perverse logic, and all bubbles must burst. And I wanted to kind of expose the perversion and also make a very key point, which is often neglected, and we cannot neglect it, which is that we collude. This culture is so sophisticated because it subtly invites our collusion. It plays on us. And I wanted just to make that more obvious and to say, actually, in the words of Greta Thunberg, the emperor has no clothes. And the neoliberal empire has no clothes, and I wanted to sort of push that part of the debate further. But thank you very much, everybody.
Sally, thank you. That's just great to hear all of that. You've brought in some aspects of the book which I think we hadn't already covered, so that's fantastic. We're going to move on now to questions, and I know we've got in the audience a lot of really very interesting people
coming here
sure
from Chris Rapley
that they would like to ask.
Should we go to Chris?
Thank you, Ro, and thank you for a super and a super event, Sally. Congratulations. I've read your book once very quickly, and I'm now going through it more slowly and really appreciating the depth as well as the breadth. It seems to me that culture and this balance between care and uncare resides in individuals, but it clearly resides in us collectively as well. So, for example, in the UK, we know that various values studies show that the majority of people are actually progressive, and yet we are dominated at present by a politics and a culture largely, as we've seen, of uncare, at least in the way it's handling the climate crisis. And part of that seems to be due, in my experience, to an asymmetry in that those of us that care about behaviours which limit our ability when we engage. So, for example, as a climate scientist, if I'm confronted with a climate denier, I have to stick to certain rules and obey certain truths, whereas they're free to use rhetoric and other schemes to influence people the other way. Ro, you wrote a wonderful blog on this some years ago, which you may recall. So another book that has really influenced me is Barbara Tuchman's The Climate of Folly, in which she says that a folly is the pursuit of a policy contrary to the self-interest of the constituency or state involved. And for it to be a folly, it must have been perceived as counterproductive in its own time, not merely in hindsight. A feasible alternative course of action must have been available, and the policy in question should be that of a group, not of an individual, and should persist beyond any one political lifetime. And her book shows that the human race has a very bad record at dealing with these asymmetries. So my question, I'm sorry I've been a bit long, is how can we take the wonderful insights that you have offered us in your book to try and overcome the asymmetries so that we can break out of this long history of folly? Because the climate and biodiversity crisis are surely the greatest follies that humans have engaged in.
Thank you very much, Chris. Sally, what would you like to respond?
Thank you very much, Chris. I'm just wondering if maybe, first of all, anyone's welcome to respond, but maybe we should take a few questions first.
Yes,
okay.
That would be fine. I'll just ask Lies van Susteren if she would like to speak. What her question is.
Well, thank you very much, Sally. What a stupendous job you've done. It's wonderful to be with all of you. My question is this. Sally, do you think that there's a reason for us, we're not all mental health professionals, but some of us are. Do you think that there is a reason for us to advocate for us to redesign how we work so that we would have a specialty even in attempting to change the culture? After all, that's what we're trained to do. Or should we try to work from the inside, our colleagues? How would you advise us as we seek to potentially reimagine ourselves if need be?
Thank you, Lisa. Shall I just take one more question, Sally? Perhaps we
probably two is okay.
Okay. Would you like to respond then?
Yes,
and then
I'll respond and then return. I'll respond to you, Lise, and then return to Chris Rapley, if that's okay. These are all very, very big questions. I would say it's very, very important that clinicians, therapists, psychoanalysts, mental health professionals actually work at becoming climate aware. And by that, I do not mean understand the facts, the bald facts about the climate emergency, which are bad enough to understand. I mean actually work it through at a feeling level. Because without that, I don't think they're going to be able to really hear what patients actually bring. I mean, it reminds me of what you said, Harriet, that if a patient comes in and says there's very bad weather, you need a sensitivity to be able to pick up what are they actually talking about. And we know that when people are traumatized, and particularly when they're traumatized because they feel that no one wants to listen to them. Okay, that kind of trauma, being faced with deafness, they might broach a subject, round the side a bit. It's terrible weather, and you need to be able to be very alert to then wonder what kind of animal is this? Are we dealing with something that belongs as part of an internal trauma? Are they talking about the climate emergency and the eco-anxiety that goes with that? How do we untangle those things? But you need to be climate aware in order to even approach that work. So I think our profession has got a great deal to do to push that climate awareness within the profession. because I think it's for a lot of analysts and therapists, they're a bit too comfortable at the moment and a bit too much in a bubble. Okay, so that's one thing. But I also think that there is another level of intervention where we can speak to people at large. That's more what I've been doing. And I'm aware that someone like you does that too, Lise. Lise has done a lot of work on trauma, on climate trauma, and how we find the news traumatic. So I think that people are calling out for containing voices to help them work through the feelings that they're struggling with, and the kind of dread, that word came up, you know, that they're struggling with. You know, just before, I want to go back to Chris Rapley. It's wonderful to have you here, Chris. He's Professor of Climate Science at University College London. It's a whole area that you're raising, the climate of folly. I didn't know that book. I will look it out. Thank you. You know, I think one thing I'd like to say is that I'm not attempting to answer what you've raised. You know, it's very important. Jared Diamond's talked about, you know, cultures that collapse and fail and so on. But what was I going to say about it? Sorry, it's gone. Give me a moment.
Sally, why don't we, while you're thinking about that one, I'll just get somebody else to ask a question, shall I? And then we can, because we can always come back to these
I hope I do, because I was going to say something. Yeah.
these rather knotty questions, which come. So I'd like to go to Caroline Hickman, who I know has a question for you. Is Caroline there?
Thank you, Ro, and thank you, everybody. Sally and the rest of the panel, I'd really like you to give me your thoughts on the increasing number of court cases that we're seeing with children and young people suing governments over their failure to act on climate change. And Sally, I think I'm particularly struck in your book where you talk about moral injury and the violation of what's right. And I was wondering if you could see any connection between that and between moral injury and the betrayal by leadership. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. And you're working in that area, I know. There's a chapter in the book on our feelings about emerging from the climate bubble. You know, where one is struggling to face the reality and the difficulty of that, where I try to pick up some of the work that's been done by many colleagues on feelings that we have as we emerge from the climate bubble. And this chapter in particular is on moral injury, which has been written about in soldiers who have fought immoral wars, where they actually realized that they've been sold an idealized picture, where they feel powerless in the face of structures that you know, dictate that they behave in certain ways, and where it actually goes against what can be described as the themis, which is one's ordinary sense of moral decency. So the argument is that the culture of uncare that we're living in, where we can't really, we can't do anything anymore. We can't order a meal, buy something from a shop, you know, without use transport, without moral concerns. You know, do I order it on from Amazon, for instance? What do I do about 0 hours workers? You know, I hate the plastic. I can't find anything that's not wrapped up in plastic. So as we as we operate in our world, in the ordinary functions of trying to live a life, we are exposed to moral injury. So it's taking that concept. Someone called, I think Fred Alport originally said this, you know, it would be surprising not to see that actually moral injury is afflicting us all. Now, the feeling of being morally injured is actually a sign of mental health, not disorder, because it's facing the pain of one's complicity and the difficulty of doing things any other way. And one point I would like to make is that about this is that interestingly, if you study moral injury, it's actually about a loss of trust. And I think that my argument in the book is that things have got to a point where people are losing trust in forms of government that we have now, in truth and lies. People are really feeling that their world is not trustable. And if we want to make a distinction between moral injury, it's all too simple putting it like this, but it might help, and post-traumatic stress disorder, which is another form of trauma that is starting to be applied and has been applied to how people are feeling about the climate crisis. PTSD is where you feel your world is not safe. And moral injury is when you see that you can't trust your world. Now, actually, we are living in a malfunctioning system that is when one wakes up to climate reality, and by that I mean the physical climate and the social climate, the human climate, and where it's headed, both these are now, people are struggling with feeling that their world is not safe and their world is not trustable. And how did it get to this pass? I mean, maybe I come back to you, Chris Rapley, at this point. There are no easy answers to this, but I do want to say that in the book, I go into, in some detail, the business of the climate bubble, and I actually link it to psychological and psychoanalytic ideas of what it is to be inside a retreat from reality, but also to bubbles, like, for instance, the financial bubble. They're very strange psychological organisms, these bubbles. They have to burst. They're based on an organized framework. A sociologist called Susan Long wrote about this, where you have to have certain things in play. You have to have exceptionalism, where people accept themselves from ordinary, having to fit in with others. You have to have collusion. You have to have organized bodies colluding, like the agencies with the financial bubble that did AAA ratings when it was based on lies. She has 5 dimensions, and she calls it a perverse culture. And she's really analyzing the bubble. It must burst. But the peculiar thing is that when you're inside it, it's happening, and you also don't know it's happening. And it's all very well saying that it's happening. For instance, interestingly, with these financial bubbles, the people who stood to lose got their money out in time, whereas, it was American homeowners whose mortgages went bust who suffered. So you could say, well, of course they knew about this. At the same time, if you look at something like, is it Michael Lewis? Michael Lewis is The Big Short, which is fascinating. I think it's an amazing analysis. You see that actually people, even those very same people, didn't believe it. It's a collective retreat from reality. So inside the bubble, you are screening out and using group dynamics to screen out the very bits of reality that you would need to factor in to not get further and further into a bubble which must burst. So I think that, to Chris, I think there's a kind of stupefaction that sets in when one's inside a bubble. And, part of my wish with the book to go into all that in such detail is to really explode, and to talk about, to explode the idea that there is no bubble, that this is fake reality is reality. There is a bubble, but also to what can we do to help people emerge from a bubble? Because one thing we know from psychoanalysis is that the work of emerging from a retreat from reality is difficult, it's ongoing. You know, you have a whole series of shocks. Sorry, I'm going on and on, but okay. But I think it produces a kind of stupefaction. You know, Greenspan said with the financial bubble, people have gone a bit crazy. People go crazy when they're in bubbles, but I think he was being disingenuous because that was a very carefully seeded bubble, actually, with the you know, deregulation, financial deregulation. But people do go a bit crazy in bubbles.
Ali, thank you. I think this idea of the crazy bubble is a really, really important one. I'm going to go now to ask Donald Campbell to ask his question, please.
Sorry, you'll have to unmute yourself in the bottom left. There you go.
Okay, is that, I'm unmuted now? Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. Just thanks for calling on me, Ray. Just to say, first of all, I want to say three things. One is that I found this the most stimulating book launch, and I wish more book launches were like this. And I think it's really very typical of Sally's desire to stimulate thought and action by having a thorough and wide-ranging and kind of impassioned discussion. Secondly, I want to say that as a psychoanalyst, I'm rather pessimistic about introducing a benevolent, caring self that doesn't already exist. Instead, I'd like to make this shift the focus back to the narcissistic self and ask the question, do you think, Sally and others on the webinar, can we expand the narcissistic self-interest to include some sense that one's survival is really dependent upon the survival of the other? If we don't do that, I don't see anything shifting this current dynamic of the haves and have-nots, the exploitations that people have been talking about today.
Thank you very much, Donald. I'll ask for one. Do you want me to get another question, Sally?
Can I just respond? Can I just respond?
Yes, do.
And I'm sorry if I'm hogging it. Please come in, anybody else. I don't believe that, Don, that this is introducing something new in the caring self, because what I try to show in the central part of the book about the culture is that there is practically a war being waged on care, actually. It's not so I think we are divided creatures. I think we have care and uncare in us, and it's not that the caring self doesn't exist. I think it's there, but I'm very interested in your point about you know, do we also need to appeal to people's self-interest? For sure, I think anything that will help at this stage, yes, we should appeal to. And it makes me want to go, I felt that I didn't quite address Caroline Hickman's point, because her concern is the children. And it's very interesting. You could say that the children are the ones, our own children are the ones who should be included in self-interest. And that's a whole other subject. You know, how do we deal with moral injury in relation to our own children, and how do we have conversations with them? And are we going to go back into the bubble of denial and not realize that actually they are paying the price? You know, so to what extent can that be mobilized? But I don't think it's an easy issue. And one of the reasons that it's not easy is that we also know that when people start feeling very bad about themselves, and the narcissistic position is much more prone to, you know, in a fragile sense, feeling very bad about itself, they can also ascend to even greater denial. It doesn't necessarily help get back in touch with reality. I think these issues are very complicated, and I'm just raising some of them, but thank you.
Thank you very much, Sally. I'm going to turn now to Maureen Katz. Maureen, could you tell us what your question is, please?
Hi, thank you. And thank you to the panelists and to the EPS for putting this on, and Sally for her extraordinary work. And I think actually really carving out this field of integrating psychoanalysis and politics and economics in this whole question about climate. My question actually it's a little bit of a different slant. It's from a psychoanalytic perspective. Rob and Sally both talked about, well, Rob in his comments talks about Sally and the kind of prescience of looking at COVID and also the nature of the climate crisis. And I wondered then, with regards to the George Floyd killing and the explosion of awareness, which was of course there in the early teens also, but the whole Black Lives Matter movement and the question about racism and the destructiveness around racism and neoliberalism and its impact as well, its overlap with environmental catastrophe. If there was some thought, I guess this is both to Rob and to Sally, about thoughts you might have about the psychological forces, not just of Uncare, that are propelled and instituted by neoliberal forces, but also actually jouissance. And from our understanding about racism, the kind of enjoyment and necessity of that kind of enjoyment in racism and in climate destructiveness.
Thank you. Sally, would you like to reply first?
Oh, Rob, no, I was wondering, Rob, have you?
Okay, let's go to Rob. Rob, would you like to respond?
So,
else, yeah, or Harriet, yeah.
Yeah. So after this past year, we've had an opportunity to think a lot about constricted breath through COVID, through the terrible sight of the knee on the neck. It's a very, very intimate feeling, and then it also opens out to the living, breathing planet. The Gaia images of the seasonal breath of the planet, and so what do we? All of us individually have had some encounter, maybe a near drowning encounter, or somebody trying to throttle us, of that desperation. And so one of the things that I'm interested in is, when you say jouissance, I'm more focused perhaps on the collectivization of the response, the ritual response, so that even if, as we look ahead to, say, the Euros, the football competition that started today, we're still seeing many teams, people taking the knee. And so you have a symbolic action that's a meme, and taking the knee has so many resonances. It's the knee on the neck, but it's also the knee of protest, the knee of prayer. And so where I see some hope and energy is in these unexpected sort of almost travel, what the anthropologist Anna Tsing calls traveling allegories. So it can be an image, a scene, a phrase that suddenly starts circulating. And so in Gaza, in Cape Town, in Lagos, in Cairo, you will see people having written, street artists, "We Can't Breathe." You'll see an image of George Floyd with flowers at the feet of the image in Gaza. And so what is it that takes hold physically, emotionally, imaginatively, politically? And how, as Sally was talking earlier about unpredictability, you get these cultural tipping points where suddenly, if a 5-year-old watching a soccer game sees men kneeling. There's an opportunity to ask the question, why? What does that mean? And the history unfolds from there, and the politics unfolds from there. So I do think, and this is something that Sally emphasizes very strongly in her book, there are cultural forces that can push back against both economic and psychological determinisms.
Thank you, Rob. Sally, I think perhaps I should just take the two more questions, and then we'll. I'm going to take them together. So I've got both Aaron Thierry and Anne McClintock would like to ask a question. Could you keep your questions brief so that we can get some answers in? Thank you very much. So Aaron first.
Okay, thanks, Fer. Hi. So I'm currently studying Extinction Rebellion and how they have organised and present in the climate movement. And one of the things that's really striking to me is how much they bring grief into the public space and public debate. A lot of their actions are kind of rituals of lament. There's been funeral marches and the Red Rebels, who symbolize kind of the blood of the planet and things. And also, I think they're very much trying to make visible this refusal to collude with the current system, and to invite others to join in calling out the emperor for having no clothes. But I kind of feel that it's still only getting to a small section of society. So what more could they do to expand this conversation and draw out this dichotomy that you've highlighted about the lack of care, but also to bring in others into that space?
Thank you, Aaron. Could we just hear Anne McClintock's question, and then we'll get the panel to answer?
Yes, thank you so much. And in fact, I think perhaps my question comes out of Aaron's question. First of all, just to thank Sally, an absolutely brilliant book and a fascinating conversation. We've been talking, and Rob mentioned this, and Rob and David, that we're living in a period of a cascading convergence of crises. We've got the COVID crises, we've got the neoliberal ransacking of the cultures and the economies, the climate crisis, and militarization. But my question is, I'm wondering if perhaps out of this convergence, there might be a paradox, which is that Rob mentioned the prescience of Sally's book in not really overtly mentioning COVID, but it's present there. So there's a kind of prescience in that. And I'm wondering if perhaps a paradox might be that the brilliant writer Arundhati Roy described pandemics as a portal that throughout history has invited cultures to think about the past and maybe reimagine the future. And I'm wondering if perhaps you might think about COVID as possibly presenting, and I think Aaron is touching on this, a kind of tipping point, both a psychic tipping point and a cultural and political tipping point, because maybe it has made people feel in the body takes this fall, what neoliberalism and the climate crisis has done. If you think of us all looking at each other from a grid, we're living in a cell. The experience of dissociation, alienation, uncare, loneliness, I'm seeing it in my students.
Right. Yeah.
And whether perhaps out of feeling this in the body, we're not thinking about neoliberalism in the head, we're living through it. And that perhaps out of this, the paradox of this epidemic, we're feeling it collectively. And there's a tremendous loneliness, and as Aaron is talking about, we're seeing this grieving, and I'm thinking a great deal about different kinds of.
Okay, can I just
yes.
move us on a little bit, because I think we need to give, we've only got about 5 minutes left. So I think there's a lot there in what you said that our panel could respond to. So I'm going to go first to Sally, then see whether anybody else on the panel would like to add anything in response to these last two questions, then finally come back to you again, Sally, for a last word. But we have only got a few minutes left. So,
gosh, there's so much here, isn't there? I think Extinction Rebellion has been doing, Aaron, a very powerful job in opening up spaces to grieve, and not least because they point to the need to do this collectively. You know, I found that this work, it's vital in this work to have groups that you can talk to about what's going on. So I think Extinction Rebellion has led the way and also has, you know, talked about, I mean, presented us with the urgency. So I just want to endorse what it's done in that sense. Maureen raised, I mean, we could have an event on any one of these topics, but you know, I don't think there are any easy answers of I can't breathe. I think we're living through a historical moment where, you know, we can say, well, we think it's about this or that, you know, we can't really know, but it seems to me that what we're pointing to is, you know, historical, horrendous injustice, racial injustice for sure. We've got, you know, but also I think it's broadening, without wishing to, you know, reduce the specificity of that, it's broadening to our moment, you know, which includes COVID. We can't breathe, you know, we're terrified we're going to not be able to breathe, and it's in our bodies. And because it's in our bodies, perhaps we're also more sympathetic to people who we might be rather deaf to quite a lot of the time. You know, there's no doubt that this has been a moment where, you know, there's been a lot more appreciation of what of other people out there, and a breaking down of what's on the cover of my book, which is this hierarchical fracturing and indifference. You know, that's how I see the cover. You know, so we're living, but I also want to add in something else, which is that I think that I would like to think, whether it's the case or not, I don't know, but I'm flagging it up, that there's also a kind of collective sense of, you know, we're sick of having to live in a system like this that affords us so little opportunity to actually make a real difference in politics, in the way we lead our lives. You know, we're sick of a perverse culture. We can't breathe in it, and we're sick of actually living in a world that actually does not take care of our ordinary needs, like clean water, clean air, as rights. You know, we're sick of it all. So I wonder how long this has been building up. You know, but I just flagged that up as a possibility, you know, that this way of organizing life leaves us not able to breathe. And can I just finally sort of add in, sorry, I think that we're also confronting a certain kind of deafness and really protesting against it. You know, children finding their parents are deaf, Black people finding white people are deaf, you know, women finding men are deaf, climate activists being sick of having to carry all the feelings themselves because the community is deaf, you know. And there's a kind of, one would hope that there's a sort of, you know, we can't breathe with all this, you know, we need a different system where we can actually listen to each other and treat each other better.
Sally, thank you. I think this takes us to this theme of how our senses are impacted, and I just wondered whether, you know, whether there is anything that Harriet or Rob or David, just very, very quickly, we've got about 3 minutes, so, you know, just a couple of sentences, if there's anything that you would like to add before we finish. Harriet.
It's of course very hard to be brief. So much rich discussion has occurred. Questions have been asked. I wanted to point to Sally's work in the book about the conflict in each of us, and taking it to a social level. There is the violence now in society. When Sally says we're tired of it, we're tired of ignoring climate change, I'm reminded of what either David or Rob said about feeling too good about too little. We really need to be concerned, I think, also about what it is in the human spirit that permits the unleashing of violence that we've seen post-pandemic. So Donald Campbell asked earlier something about narcissism. I think we need to remember healthy narcissism is vital to survival. how do we understand the violence we're seeing? That's not narcissism. That's not anything, that's not healthy. We have that sort of problem to understand. And I think actually Sally's book charts a way of thinking about it. Thanks.
Thank you. Rob or David, do you want a very last quick thought before we close?
David.
Well, just picking up on what Harriet was saying and connecting it back to the earlier comment about narcissism, I think it's important to keep in mind that if we were to see these calculations clearly, it would all be, it is in our self-interest to move quickly and reform. Mm-hmm. And so on some level, the biggest challenge is coaching ourselves and those around us to, to see clearly. It's not about choosing selflessness over selfishness. It's just seeing clearly. And I think that's one of the great tools that Sally's book offers.
Thank you. Rob, a last thought. Anything?
Well, I would just say that, I'm very interested in some of the newer work, people like Suzanne Simard on the Wood Wide Web of, at a biological level, the recognition that there are these vast mycorrhizal networks connecting different organisms tree to tree, and that this idea of self-interested altruism seems to me, both at a biological and a political level, really salient. And part of the work that Sally's book does in terms of political history is to remind us of the intense assault on the idea of social democracy, participatory democracy, that communities are most resilient when they're integrated, when they're sharing, when they're interdependent. And so I think both from a biological perspective and in terms of political history, there are very robust other models that suggest the self can do better when it recognizes these interdependent dimensions and the value to the self of being selfless in many circumstances.
Thank you, Rob. Sally, do you want to just offer a farewell sentence?
Just thank you very much, everybody, for coming. I've almost got to the end of my mocktail here, and thank you. Thank you, Ro, for chairing. And I want to thank the tech people, Robert and Tara, very much for looking after us so well. Thank you.
Well, and from me, final thanks to our wonderful panel, to Sally for her book, and to the tech team, and to everybody for joining us today. Thank you.